So, we get Jack Preuss elected, and we've had John Tejan elected just a few months earlier. One of the things that folks say to John Tejan is, you know, even though you've accepted the call to be president of the seminary, given what's happened at the Synod Convention, you could still back out. And he says, no, I won't. I'm going in. And that's John Tejan. I mean, one thing that I think commendable about him is he viewed this as a calling, and he operated as such. He also was very convinced of the correctness of his position, and was didn't take to those who thought otherwise particularly well, or threatened his authority well. Let me put it that way. And one of those who did was his colleague Martin Charlemagne. And here I want to say a couple of things. Lance, you wanted me to say something about, was it you who, somebody said to me earlier, one of the big questions is what happens with Charlemagne? Because in the end, just to kind of move things along, it is Martin Charlemagne who introduces the idea, well, that's a bad way of putting it. Martin Charlemagne actually writes the letter that gives Jack Preuss, as president of the synod, the I was going to say excuse, that's not the right word. The ammunition was the other word I thought, to do the investigation of the seminary. And people are just kind of surprised by that fact, given the turmoil that Charlemagne caused back in the late 50s, early 60s. And we were talking at our table here during lunch at the 1973 convention. One of the things that happens is that the seminary faculty majority is given the opportunity to speak to the convention as a whole and to answer questions. And one of the statements that is made there, I believe it's by Edgar Krentz, an Old Testament professor. Krentz says, well, all we're doing is carrying out the method that we learned from Martin Charlemagne. And Charlemagne about goes out of his seat and loses his mind, and I mean, there's a lot of distress. So the question is, what happens? And you know, I showed you that one book a little bit earlier by Fred Danker with the red cover called No Room in the Brotherhood. And you know, it talks about what he subtitled the Preuss-Otten Purge of Missouri. But if you read that book, the culprit is Martin Charlemagne, because he's Judas. He betrayed the cause in the thinking of Fred Danker. So what in the world happened? Well, the simple answer, and I'm not sure it's satisfactory, but it's a part of this, is that Martin Charlemagne, how he reached this conclusion, I will never know. But he was convinced that when Führerbringer retired as president, that he had an excellent chance to succeed him. This despite, I mean, the massive turmoil that had characterized, you know, the early 60s. And, you know, to me, it's like, well, what are you thinking? It's not going to happen. There's no way in the world it's ever going to happen. But he convinced himself. And what convinced him, I think, of that was the fact that he had taught by then basically another 10 years worth of students who were very supportive of him. And when the time for nominations for the presidency came about, he got a ton of nominations to be president of the St. Louis Seminary. And he had students that were working on his behalf to get more, you know, they'd call up their buddies and say, hey, you got to nominate Charlemagne, that kind of thing. And it can be, I suppose, an easy thing to mistake the number of nominations you get in a run-up to a seminary presidency for actual support that you have, if you get my drift. And I think he made that mistake. But he thought he had a really good chance at getting this, and every indication that I've seen, and the book will make this point in far more detail, he wanted it badly. And so if you don't get that, you know, you can imagine the disappointment that a person would experience. Please.
I just wonder if he kind of picked it up in the Army Armed Services. too. My son's an officer, and it seems like to move up in there, you have to be ambitious
Yep.
and know how to cover your tracks. And it seems like he did both of those.
That's interesting you put it that way. Let me say this. One of the things I do with great regularity is read other people's mail. All right? I call it research. So I've read we have a huge, at the Historical Institute in St. Louis, Concordia Historical Institute, we have a huge amount of material that Martin Charlemagne retained and then delivered to the Institute. And I've gone through almost all of it, which has been, weeks and weeks worth of work, and very interesting stuff. What I didn't find was a whole lot of stuff, just a little bit, dealing with the presidential election in 1969, which I found very curious. However, this is how, when you send letters to other people, sometimes they keep them, and sometimes they donate them to the Historical Institute. And then sometimes other nerds come and read them. And so there was a guy by the name of Louis Lochner, who had won a Pulitzer Prize for reporting during World War II, was a Missouri Synod member of the congregation in either New York City or on the Jersey side of the Hudson, I can't remember. Anyway, when Charlemagne was out at Union in New York, at the Seminary in New York, where he did his second doctorate, they got to be very close friends. And so you had this very accomplished and very well-connected guy, Lochner, who when the nomination process came up, he said, "I'll do anything I can to help you." And so later on, Lochner kept all the letters that he got from Charlemagne, and of course he kept copies of what he sent to Charlemagne. So the stuff wasn't in Charlemagne's paper. He kind of cleansed the files, you might say, but it was all in the Lochner papers that I found. Yeah, so when I say he really wanted this, I have a basis for saying he really wanted this. And he worked hard to make it happen, and it didn't happen. In fact, in the end, when the names came before the electors, and there were 4 electors only, that's how we operate funny in the Missouri Synod. The president of the Synod gets a vote. The president back then of the chairman of the Board of Higher Education gets a vote. The district president gets a vote, and then the Board of Control as a group had 1 vote, right? And we do it similarly now. The difference is the chairman of the Board of Directors of Synod gets a vote instead of the Higher Education Board. So there's only 4 votes when you get right down to it, although one of the votes is made up of 13 people or 12 people. Anyway, when those 4 entities are voting, Charlemagne's name wasn't even in front of them. Yeah. And none of the sitting faculty, and a bunch of them had been nominated, none of the sitting faculty had been brought before the electors. So it was going to be somebody from outside coming in, no matter what. But Charlemagne didn't know that. And so when the news came down, it was devastating for him. It was really very devastating. And when he found out who it was, he was extraordinarily unhappy, and then became even more so. Because in the summer, so right after the election, Tejan happens. Tejan accepts the call. Jack Preuss gets elected. And right in the midst of all this, so it's already a real messy situation, the seminary puts out a large issue of its theological journal, which is called Concordia Theological Monthly. And I think they cram 3 months together, June, July, August of 1969. And in it, there's an article, and this was really kind of coincidental. There's an article by John Tejan in it. And it was supposed to be an issue honoring what became his predecessor, Alfred Feuerbringer. And I suppose some people hoped that he would be president by the time it was published. But whatever the case may be, here comes this article. Well, the article is called "The Gospel and the Theological Task." And, you hear it and you think, well, what could be wrong with that, right? I mean, the gospel and the theological task. Hopefully, the gospel informs the theological task, right? And there's a certain sense in which, it's pretty straightforward in that regard. But to cut to the chase with this article, Tejan does a couple of things. So this is point number 2 in kind of the mix here. Point number 1, disappointment over not getting the presidency. Point number 2, the article, Gospel and the Theological Task. In it, Tejan poses a question. And the question, as he says it, this is not a direct quote, but it's pretty close. Can the gospel be explained, confessed in enduringly valid terms? And you heard me a little bit earlier make this point. He's asking, does the gospel in a sense transcend time? So that you can say, like I would, Jesus suffered and died, his death and rose again. His death and resurrection have taken away your sins. Can you say that? And it's valid for every single human being from Adam till the Lord comes back. And my answer is, yeah. Because that's an enduringly valid expression. It transcends time. Because that's the person and work of Jesus, right? You with me? Tejan's answer is no. No. Not if we want to be relevant. I know it sounds kind of contemporary, doesn't it? Yeah, that's why you got to be a historian. You read this stuff and it's just, here we go in the merry-go-round, we're going around again, After a while, you just kind of get callous to the whole thing. Oh yeah, here's the heresy. But so Tejan says, if we want to speak the gospel in a valid way to our current situation, we can't start with some preconceived idea of what the gospel is. We have to start with the circumstances in which the gospel is proclaimed. Or, as the World Council of Churches put it, the world sets the agenda for the church. Now that's almost a direct quote too, all right? Teaching, yeah. So if you can't speak the gospel in a way that he says was what we would typically think of a traditional expression of the gospel valid for Martin Luther in his time? Absolutely. But we don't live in Martin Luther's time anymore. Things have changed too much. And so to say this forgiveness of sin stuff is the way of expressing the gospel is just not the case. It is a way of expressing the gospel at best, but when you talk about the gospel, you have to start with the situation. Well, so tell me then, John, what is the gospel? Right? That's what you get down to. And the answer that had emerged by this time at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, and this is what John Warwick Montgomery called gospel reductionism in its bare form, and this was articulated especially by a theologian at the seminary named John Eliot. The gospel is good news in a bad situation. Okay? So, if you want to speak the gospel in a meaningful way, you have to find out what the bad news is first. And it's, in the words of the Bryan Adams song, The Summer of '69, right? You're too young for that. You gotta be old like I am. So it's the summer of 1969. We're 2 years past the summer of love, right? That was 67. We're instead in the mud of Woodstock, right? The age of Aquarius, not happening. Don't take the brown acid. Okay. It was crazy. I mean, this stuff was nuts. So what's bad news, especially for young men in the summer of 1969? What's that? Draft. Vietnam and the draft. And my folks were teaching at The Ohio State University at this point in time. I was a kid. My dad had all these music students, right, who were facing at graduation the possibility of being drafted. And we literally had on our TV not only the moon landing in July of 1969, they would come over and watch the ball drop for draft at our house. Because they didn't have TVs in their dorm rooms at that point in time. So they'd come over to the house and watch, what was it, 1A or, that kind of stuff. I forget how that works. But, and they're watching their futures happen. And it was terrible. I'm a little kid, 7 years old, and they're watching their future. Oh, I got to go to Vietnam, and I'm going to die. What should I do? Well, go to Canada, right? Is one option. Or go to seminary. Because you had your deferment. You had your deferment as a university student, and you could extend it as a seminarian. And hopefully by the end of that, even though you hated Nixon, the thing would be over, right? And you'd miss the whole deal. Not coincidentally at all, you have a spike in the number of students going to seminary in that year. You have a spike coming in. And, I'm not questioning anybody's motives. I'm scared of dying. I may do some different things too. But oftentimes, the seminary enrollments aren't what they used to be. Yeah, and we don't have Vietnam either. But and we don't want it back. So anyway, you have this kind of dynamic at work in this. So if the bad news is draft, you could be drafted. What's good news? Your sins are forgiven. Who cares? I want good news in this bad situation. What's the good news? Protest against the draft and overturn it. That is the gospel as such. And that is expressed in valid terms in a concrete situation where there is life-threatening bad news. You see? Now, it's kind of fun to watch your faces. At this point, what? The problem, of course, in the Missouri Synod is what? Some of these fellas are saying things like, we're committed to the gospel. We are absolutely supportive of the biblical gospel, which they mean is the good news in the bad situation that you have to figure out. Other examples, you have race riots during the 60s, be active in the civil rights movement, that kind of thing. Women's ordination, bad news for women is you can't be ordained. In order to give them good news, you must support women's ordination, that kind of thing. Just you got to find the bad news for that particular person and express good news in a concrete way. Otherwise, you're just blowing smoke. And so to feel like you've done some, Jesus died and rose again for your sins. And they're saying, sins? What's sin? And this is the 60s, remember? What's sin? Please.
Two questions about Charlemagne. Why do you think he did not get voted in at the seminary? And then the second is, would Charlemagne's view of the gospel be the same as teaching? Is it
No.
teaching?
The second one is no.
Okay.
That's a simple one. The first one, why not? Why wasn't he voted in? The first was the hangover from the early 60s stuff. As soon as the position, it was known the position was opening up, there were a whole series of attacks on him that came back up. Back in 62, you apologized and you taught this and that kind of thing.
Also, they thought he betrayed.
They just said, have you changed? Have you changed? And he would always be very explicit that he did not change. Always. Secondly, he tried too hard. The campaign, I'll call it that. The campaign to get him elected president really turned a lot of people off. People that had votes turned them off. Please.
So just to kind of maybe clarify, the gospel reductionism, could you say that's what the gospel got equated with social action?
Well, that would be one expression of it. Not the only. But it would have to take social circumstances into account because the world sets the agenda. So what's bad? And the bad news takes on all kinds of different forms. And if you want to give good news, it has to specifically address that particular bad news. So that would be one expression of it. There's not one expression of the gospel. There is gospel. But to me, what's particularly interesting about this, I made this point years ago, years and years and years ago, is that when you read through this article by Tejan, when he's talking about the gospel is always in the passive voice. It is what is formed, and it is what is shaped, rather than that which acts and creates its own reality. And that's the disaster right there, because now you just have this amorphous thing, you know.
For him, the gospel is not living and active and sharp.
Well, he would, yes, but only if you allow the world to shape it. Yeah, yeah. But yeah. So, I think maybe this cuts to your point. The only way the gospel is going to be effective is if you as interpreter apply it properly. That make sense? Yeah.
So then it's the person who was applying its fault if it wasn't.
If it's, yeah, because you're up there talking about Jesus died for your sins, and that would be great for Martin Luther and people in the 16th century, but it just doesn't have any meaning for the modern person in 1969. Now, interestingly enough, I don't want to be unfair to Tejan. When you asked him, we'll get back to our earlier point. When you asked him, so does that mean it can be anything? He would say no. It has to be creedal in character, and specifically shaped by the Apostles' Creed. And so when you would hear him confess his faith, he would basically give you an outline, shorter or longer, of the Apostles' Creed. And he would affirm the incarnation and affirm the death and resurrection of Jesus. You know, he'd affirm all those things. And you hear him do it, and it's like, well, yeah, I'm with you there, but that's him, right? And what happens, of course, with his students is the same thing that happened with Charlemagne's students. They said, well, why are we bound to that? Right? And they're the ones who then just start pushing this out, and other profs start pushing this out. So Charlemagne, when people blame him for it, he says, it wasn't my fault. I was saying you had to stop here. It's Tejan's fault because he says you have to stop here. And his colleagues said, you taught us the way, brother.
Cash saw my own personal Jesus.
You would say that, you southerner. Yeah, I lived 1.5 miles from Johnny Cash when I was in Tennessee. I caught the biggest largemouth bass of my life right off from his house before it burned down. Please.
Was there tighter reigns?
Pardon?
Was there tighter reigns in the 50s when we're seeing different stuff happening in the early 60s Catholic Church even?
Yeah, they're going. I mean, this is part of the air everybody's breathing. That's a great point. Yep. Exactly.
You got Father Droppy here in Milwaukee, right?
Who?
Father Droppy.
I don't know that.
He led,
You led the race ride.
Did he? Yeah, there you go. Yeah, sure.
Across the 6th Street Viaduct.
Sure. Yeah, no kidding. Okay. Well, and so that's a great point. I'm glad to bring it up because the guy that the guys, the more progressive, I'll use that word, guys at faculty at Concordia Seminary and a lot of students, they feel more affinity with Father Droppy than they do with a traditional Missouri Synod pastor. So who do they hang around with? Father Droppy, right? Is that right? Droppy? Droppy, okay. But yeah, so when you're talking about your relationships, who do you think of first of all as your brother? Well, you think of the people who think the same way and act the same way you do, and who's your enemy? It's some conservative, radical Lutheran with a big beard. No one in particular, but if I didn't do that to Pastor Dusty, I mean, I'm sorry. You've been putting up with that for way too long. I'm sorry. It's great when you have your former students with you. All right, so, but I mean, do you see that? I mean, so with Charlemagne, he starts to say, no, you're going too far. And his colleagues are saying, you showed us the way. You showed us the way. He loses his mind over that's a technical term, over this this article that Tejan puts out, and he says, I've got to respond. When they decide to use it as the basis for the faculty retreat in the late summer, early fall of 1969, so they're using Tejan's article, basically he's saying this is going to set the tone for my entire presidency. He attacks. He comes in and attacks and writes a paper with a series of what he calls animadversions, which are essentially theses that challenge Tejan at every point. So here you have, a tenured prof. So try and get rid of them. Good luck. But tenured prof of significant standing in the LCMS go right after the brand new president. So that's point number 2. Now point number 3 with Charlemagne. Why? Things have changed, and they change after the summer of love. If you were around back then, and especially if you lived on a college campus like I did. I mean, before my dad taught at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, from 64 to 67. My earliest memories are from there, and then we moved to Columbus, and we were at Ohio State. We were at Ohio State during the riots. During Kent State, I was with my mom at the library, and we kept having to go up levels as the tear gas leaked in. Do that when you're 6 years old and see if it doesn't have an impact. But so we were always in I grew up always in the context of higher education. In fact, I started at the Ohio State School at the age of 3, and I have not left school since then. But some of us are very slow learners. Anyway, it really got crazy, if you remember those days, once you got past 1967. I mean, it really got nuts. And to be in Columbus after the Kent State matter was something else. It was just incredible to see. But even previous to that, I remember, again, we had students over all the time at our house, and so I was always, I didn't know any different. Everybody had long hair and a beard, as far as I was concerned. That's just what you wore, because that's what everybody had. And when I would see people complaining about that, I couldn't understand it because it was totally outside my experience. But one of the people that really bothered was the general. And so I actually found a letter where he's complaining about the students at the seminary. The students, good grief. We have more students coming in than ever, but brother, they're a bunch of hippies, a bunch of pot-smoking hippies. And they have, they have beards, and they dress like slobs, and they wear these wire-rimmed glasses. He mentions, which of course I think means they wore the round rims like John Lennon did. It was a Marxist. So and Martin Charlemagne hated Marxism. I mean, he hated Marxism. So anyway, you put those three things together, and that's for somebody as a powerful thinker as he is, and determined as well, and also having a certain kind of detachment. If he were to be, for some reason, removed from the faculty of the seminary, he's a brigadier general. He's fine. You can do this when you have that kind of net underneath you when you're on the trapeze. You can try all kinds of tricks. What's that?
You have a pretty good retirement.
You better believe it. Yep, you better believe it. So he comes in, he goes after Tejan. And he pushes Tejan hard, and Tejan is brand new at this. I was mentioning to somebody a little bit earlier, people used to ask me when I became president of Fort Wayne, what surprised you the most? And my answer was not very much, because I'd been the academic dean, so I worked like 10 feet away from the president, and I saw his misery every day. And then was dumb enough to allow my name to stand. But not too much. But what did surprise me was how much time I spent with lawyers. And most of it was really good. Really excellent and encouraging and that kind of thing. Some of it was just kind of weird, like negotiating with the electric company so that we could avoid eminent domain and making a ton ton of money on a very modest sale of a portion of our gigantic property that's a floodplain anyway. That's too much info. You didn't need that. But then there were the miserable times as well, where something went wrong with whomever, and you just had to work your way through this kind of stuff. What people underestimate that a seminary president deals with is the scope, the kind of things that confront you every single day, every minute of every hour of every single day of every single month of every year that you're in that position. And it just grinds after a while. So when a guy like John T, and I knew this going in, I knew it going in. And I talked to Wenthy. I was kind of his release valve, my predecessor, Dean Wenthy, and he'd rant for a little bit and feel better. So I wasn't surprised, but Tejan had no experience in this at all. And so he gets thrown into the deep end of the pool. The temperature is about 180, and it's like, here you go, John, swim, and he's over his head. He's way in over his head. Now he has profound support from the faculty, other than Martin Charlemagne and 4 other guys. So out of the 50 faculty members, he's got 45 of them that have his back. And they are very, very strongly supportive of him, those 45 or about. And but at the same time, when you're the president, you're the point guy, and everything comes at you. Every arrow is aimed at you. And I think he was kind of overwhelmed by that side of it, especially when you're stepping into a situation that is already, exercised and excited. And when you have now, when you assumed, or at least anticipated having support from the Synod President, and now you don't. So what do you do if you're in that circumstance? Well, I think what he would have done later is take a more firmer stance early on and to speak plainly, to try and catalyze support for himself. But instead he tries to temporize and kind of kick the can down the road and tell everybody nothing has changed. Everybody knows things have changed. Everybody knows things have changed. But he's, no. Well, this is where the Springfield faculty starts to emerge. They say, we're having conversations between portions of the faculty from both institutions, and we're not agreeing. We're finding profound disagreement between our 2 faculties. And the only guys who are agreeing with us from the St. Louis faculty are these 5. The rest are pushing back, and it's basic stuff. It's biblical teaching. What's the problem? And Charlemagne picks up on that and says, John, to President Tejan, you've got to address this. And it's not some kind of abstract theological problem. Here are the guys who are teaching it. Right? So you name names. Well, that, of course, puts Charlemagne at odds with his colleagues, of course. And they're highly critical of him for that. But then it kind of puts Tejan into a corner. What are you going to do? Are you going to do anything? And if you're going to do something, how fast should you act? And he doesn't want to. So Charlemagne does it for him. And on April 9th, 1970, and there's some meetings and stuff that have gone on in the interim between April and pushing back to the early part of the academic year, back to September of 1969. By the time you get to April of 1970, April 9th specifically, Charlemagne writes a letter to J.O. Preuss, formal letter, copies John Tejan, the president, and in it says there are huge problems theologically at Concordia Seminary, St. Louis, and you should you should carry out an investigation of the seminary. So, this is the guy that the president and academic dean saved at Cleveland in 1962, right? And now he's saying, investigate our seminary because of the teaching that's going on here. And his colleagues never forgive him. Never forgive him. Jack Price, of course, as new president, he's still a relatively new president too, but he's pretty comfortable in his role, having been a seminary president for 7 years prior to this. That's probably decent prep to be a Synod president. He says, all right, let me take this up. Well, he's not sure what to do specifically, but he knows he's going to investigate. The question is how? How am I going to do this? And the how ends up being answered pretty quickly when, and I try and be very sensitive on this point because I wonder, how would I respond? How would I have responded as a brand new president if one of my faculty members had written to President Harrison, this kind of, you need to investigate the Fort Wayne Seminary? And honestly, I probably would have said, yep, bring him in. Do it. Got nothing to hide. Right? But Tejan instead makes a second misstep, in my opinion. First, on April 10th, so day after the letter is sent, he calls Martin Charlemagne in to have a meeting. Now, anytime the president calls you in, it's not going to be fun. I can tell you this for a fact. Or better yet, when I was talking to people, if I took them to a certain coffee house, it was going to be great. If I took them to a different coffee house, it was not going to be great. And everybody knew, where are we going? Okay. You'll find out when we get there. So Tejan calls Charlemagne in and chews him out. Just blows his cork completely. And as Charlemagne will describe it, he actually goes back to his office, and he's clearly very shaken by the whole event. Writes a memo to himself to keep track of what actually occurred. He says, I've been in the military a long time, and I've heard a lot of officers dress down other officers beneath them and on down to the basic ranks, and I've never heard anything like this. And the kind of language that was applied to me by a pastor, he was profoundly impacted by this. And Tejan really just, this was obviously a misstep, and his anger got the better of him. What he then decides to do, meaning Tejan, is to have a special faculty meeting. So calls the faculty together. Now, if I were president, the first thing I would have done was call those who actually have oversight of the faculty together, which is the Board of Control. But he calls the faculty together to judge one of their own. He doesn't announce the agenda, which you're always supposed to do. And he holds the meeting with Charlemagne absent. Because Charlemagne's he's in the military, and he actually had military duty to carry out the day that the meeting is happened. April 16th is what it was. And at that meeting, he reads his courtesy copy of the letter to Preuss to the faculty as a whole, without permission. Again, the ethics of this is very questionable. And at which point then, a group that has already come together knowing about this in advance, they've drafted a resolution and they put it before the faculty to censure their colleague Martin Charlemagne. So they think, we'll do this. This is kind of, faculty sometimes do this kind of stuff where they think, oh, we'll do this and everybody will listen. No, people won't. Instead, it looks like a railroad, like they're railroading Charlemagne. And I think this has a significant impact then on Jack Preuss, on how he decides to proceed. When Tejan and the faculty majority, and especially Tejan and his leadership team, respond as vigorously and as harshly as they do to Charlemagne, and one little part of me says, I get why, but when they do that, it's one thing to think about doing it, it's another thing to do it. What's the biblical word? The measure by which you judge, you will be judged. And that's what it sets loose. That's what it sets loose. And from that point forward, from this point forward, there's really no way you're going to avoid a profound controversy. There's just no way. So Charlemagne goes to the Board of Control, as they're called. We would call them regents now, Board of Regents now, and says, I know you're going to talk about me at your next meeting. Can I appear? No, they don't. So they don't give him a forum. To make the long story short, Preuss finally says by September of 1970. So it's been several months. We're going to put together this fact-finding committee. It's going to have 5 members, and they're going to interview every single member of this faculty. And they do so from mid-December of 1970 through the early part, middle part of March 1971. So that's 4 months. They interview over 45 people, and a couple hours each. It's an enormous task. And they sit down and they go through all the questions. Let's see if I think I have the list here for you. The chairman of it is Paul Zimmerman, who at that point in time, here we are, president of Concordia College, Ann Arbor. He's joined by Karl Barth, whom some of you may know. Later, by this time actually. Wasn't he DP by this time? Yeah. Elmer Folber, who had been the head of CPH, Paul Streufert, who was a pastor in Cleveland, and then Armin Mollering, who was a pastor in New Jersey, who interestingly enough had brought false doctrine charges against John Tejan back in the early 1960s. He may have been a little biased. All right. They interview, as I said, from December 70 to March 1971, and then in a Herculean labor between the middle of March 71 and June of 71, so again, 3 months, Paul Zimmerman puts together a report, pretty good sized report on what they found. And he delivers it to Preuss, Dr. Preuss, and then Preuss in turn gives a copy to John Tejan as the chief executive officer of the board and says to Tejan, deliver this to the board. And he does, as well as other folks. Right? You're sharing. Everybody wants. You got to share. Well, it's not good news, so it's not the gospel. But anyway. And all this in the run-up, Eunice, to the Milwaukee Convention in 1971. So here you are. I mean, this is the thing that strikes me. I've been in higher ed my whole life, my whole professional career, really. And higher ed, things move slowly, right? Try to get a faculty to change. Change? Kind of thing. Panic sets in. And the church moves slowly, and you should. You should consider things well and carefully. But we are moving at light speed at this point in time. This is only 2 years since Jack Preuss has been elected president. And here we are already at the point of the next convention, and the question is, how are we going to handle this? Well, the biggest thing facing, and I want to point this out, that we have, again, in light speed, moved from point 3 to point 5 on your outline. The biggest thing that can happen, and yeah, we got to get to 12, but pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. The biggest thing, in my opinion, that happens at 71 are the elections for the board of the St. Louis Seminary. They already have a majority that are moderate in terms of their commitments. So not only do you have 45 out of 50 faculty members supporting John Tejan, you have a majority of the board supporting John Tejan. He's in a great spot. A great spot. However, one man is elected at this point in time who joins a couple of other real solid guys who are already on the board. And his picture is immediately to the right of the Milwaukee Convention, and that's Walter Disson. And Walter, obviously Eunice's brother, and one of my dear friends over the course of my entire time as a seminary prof. Absolutely remarkable person. I'll tell you one story. In the run-up to me being called, I was attacked by a district president who was on our board because when my mother-in-law and father-in-law's, when my in-laws' congregation went vacant, I was a pastor down in Tennessee. The district president said, it's not really a big deal if you have a pastor do the Lord's Supper or not. So my poor mother-in-law calls me up and says, is this important? I think it's important. And I said, you're right, Vanita, it's very important. And I disagree with your district president saying that this is a good idea. Not knowing that I would be then put forward for the faculty at the seminary, and he was a member of the board. And so this guy just came after me for all he was worth. And it's like, well, okay, fine, bring it on. Was sort of where I was.
What BP was this?
I'm not saying. And so the...
What state did your in-laws live in?
What's that? He's still alive, otherwise I'd say.
What state did your in-laws live in?
So I'm outside, I'm down in Tennessee, and one afternoon in the late spring of 1996, I get a phone call from a guy I'd heard of, but I'd never met, and his name's Walter Disson. He's calling from Virginia, and he said, well, you got a big problem on your hands. That's how he introduced himself to me. And I said, yeah, who is this? And Walter Disson, okay. Oh, all right. Yeah, I'm not trying to do the imitation because I'm bad at it. So we talked a little bit, and he said, this is kind of where things are at. And I said, fair enough, I don't need to go anywhere, so I'm not worrying about this too much. He said, you just need to know this. The district president involved with this, when he was a pastor, he meddled in all sorts of congregational stuff in other places. So if he's accusing you of meddling, I will bring out every letter of his that I have ever kept. And believe me, he had them all. He kept them all. So since that time, Walter Disson has been my friend. But it didn't shift the board to having a conservative majority, but you had now a number of individuals. Eugene Finke was another layman. Very solid layman. And Walter Disson and Charles Burmeister, who were absolutely committed to our synod's theological doctrinal position and who stood absolutely firm, even though they knew they were going to lose every single vote in this. They did the right thing over and over and over again and made the good confession. God bless them. God bless them. And so Walter was elected secretary of the board. And that's, you see him there, that picture of him on your outline. He's working on one of his he was a lawyer, on one of his yellow, legal size pads. And in his papers there are all these, and it's just, I'm telling you, I would have had my book done a long time ago if it wasn't for Walter Disson keeping all this stuff. And I'm glad he did, because I'm reading through all of it. I call it research, it's not reading other people's mail. All right.
Well, I think people ought to know how important it is to be the secretary.
Yep, absolutely, Eunice. Yep.
What the secretary can and cannot do.
Right, exactly. You keep the record. And he was invaluable in that regard. The work he did was invaluable. And he did that at Fort Wayne later on, too, when I was there. And just a wonderful, wonderful, faithful man. Yes, sir.
Was this John
Teaching?
Yeah, was he still at Concordia and still on the board, or when did
He's the president of the seminary. Yeah.
Okay.
He's elected in May of 1969, and he stays in that position. And he's the focal point of this whole thing. So really, when you get to the controversy, it's a good question. When you get to this whole controversy, there are two figures. The president of Synod, who is J.O. Price, Jacob Price. Everybody calls him Jack. And John Teachin on the other side is president of the seminary. Yes?
And he was secretary of every board that he was on.
I know.
And that made a big difference.
Huge difference. So he was secretary of the CSL board, and then he was secretary of the Commission on Appeals, and then he was secretary of the Fort Wayne board, and then he was secretary of the CSL board again when he served in that capacity in the teens. Amazing.
40 years.
I know, and went to all these conventions. God bless him. Cancel out all his time in purgatory. Oh, he would kill me if he heard me say that. He would kill me. All right, one real brief Walter Disson story. So he's on the board when I get called, and when we had the showdown with this particular district president, I don't know if he had told this DP that I have your letters. I have copies of your letters. But when it got to the interview, didn't come up, strangely enough, other than very, very gently. What do you think about a seminary professor intruding in the affairs of a local congregation? I said, people ask me my opinion, I'm going to tell them. Okay. And then he's enough questions. So then it goes over to Disson. Disson asked me a question. You've heard me tell this story, Eunice. Asked me a question, and me being a young, very erudite theologian. Blah, 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 blah. 5 minutes into my answer, blah, 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 blah. I'm feeling very good about myself. And Walt says, no, stop. You misunderstood the question. Well, could you repeat the question? Yes. Are you saved by grace or works? Grace. Thanks. Oh, what fun. So the convention goes, and it's again, the balance doesn't change, but the people who are involved are significant. And that will then lead to a whole slew of things, and I'm going to do these real quick. But one professor, his contract is not renewed, and this will become yet another step along in the path to the ultimate confrontation. Where John Tejan, Jack Preuss is very direct with John Tejan, do not let this man teach. He denies the Red Sea crossing. He denies the reality of angels, the existence of angels. He denies the reality of a real devil, this kind of thing. This guy can't teach at the seminary anymore. Well, John Tejan ignores Jack Preuss on this point. And so that leads Jack then to pull out of his sleeve, he had it, he was holding it, a document called a Statement of Scriptural and Confessional Principles. Pastor Fisher mentioned it a little bit earlier today, which is a very clear statement of traditional Missouri Synod theology, especially on the nature and character of Scripture. It's very, very, you wouldn't be, if you haven't read it and you did, you wouldn't be surprised by any of it. You'd be like, well, yeah. It was written by Ralph Bowman. He was the drafter he was working for the CTCR at this point in time, but he drafted it, and then Jack put it out in March of 1972 because of the Aylen thing, and told the Board of Control, use this as you're assessing the theological positions of the faculty members. And the board says thanks, but no thanks. So now it becomes a board issue too. They basically say, they thumb their noses at the president of Synod. So that puts Jack Preuss into a really interesting position. The board has said, essentially, the faculty hates the document, and the board says we're not going to use it. So what do? Well, Jack Preuss has had this report from the fact-finding committee for almost a year now, right? You remember back, it was June of 1971 that he got it. He did not release it to the Synod at large, okay? Even though Paul Zimmerman was ready, he made a bunch of copies, enough for every delegate at the Synod convention in Milwaukee, and drove over in his car with them in the trunk. And I always have this image of him driving his Olds 98 like this with all these things in the back and sparks flying off the rear, that kind of thing. Probably not true, but it's a great image. And it doesn't come out. But Tejan has it, and he has shared it with at least a group of 5 fellow members of the faculty, and he said to Jack Preuss on several occasions, we already have a response drafted. So Jack says, well, I gave you my report. How about you give me yours? And Tejan says, no. So, there's a little chutzpah here, huh? On the part of the seminary president, right to the face of the president of the Synod. Nope, not doing it. So, track with me here, and if I lose you, stop me. Since John Tejan's response has been written on the basis of the June 71 report, guess what Jack Preuss does? He writes a new report and doesn't show it to John Tejan. Turnabout's fair play, right? Maybe not the most, gentlemanly thing, but it is what it is. So he puts this thing together, and you see it here on it's actually September 1st or 2nd of 1972. Nobody has seen this thing. And boom, out it comes. So this blue book, everybody calls it the blue book because it's blue. Shockingly enough. Report of the Synodical President comes out, and it has such a long title, nobody uses the title, so they just call it the Blue Book. But now Tietjen has a huge problem because the first thing it says is we didn't find any evidence of false doctrine with respect to like fundamental teachings of the church. We didn't have any professor deny the Trinity, for example. But we did have a lot of confusion, and we did find an awful lot of, what's the word I want, just kind of allowing for maybe the professor didn't hold to an aberrant position himself, but he would allow others to do that and say, yeah, we can send pastors out in the church if they don't believe this stuff, even though I do, kind of thing. And as John Tietjen will say, as soon as this thing came out, we knew it was a disaster for Concordia Seminary. So the question they had to answer is, what do we do? And what they did was to put out what everybody called the Brown Book, which is a document called fact-finding or fault-finding. And that's the document based on the 1971 report, not the 1972 report. And that's that report, so that response to that report brings up all this stuff, like the vigil I told you about this morning. That's nowhere in this report. But it was in the June 71 report. So those guys bring that up, and and people are like, why are you bringing this up? And by the way, what was going on with this thing, And everybody starts investigating it and find, man, this was crazy. Is that what's actually going on? It's saying, well, none of that came up in here. I don't care if it didn't come up in here. What were you doing? Kind of thing. So, I mean, it just, the irony of that to me is something pretty remarkable. But as you can imagine, also it doesn't do much to settle the waters between the two competing sides. The Board of Control, and this is point 8 on your outline, tries to settle the whole matter. It's a kind of a last-ditch effort on January 15th, 1973. And what they do that day is to vote individually on every faculty member as to whether or not they should be commended for their position, corrected, which means they're holding to a false position, or they can abstain from voting on individuals. And so they start in the afternoon and they go one by one. So you're looking at having a discussion and a vote on 40 plus faculty members. What do you think happens?
Who's voting on this?
The Board of Control. Yeah, thank you. To clarify that. So the Board of Control is voting on this. There are a number of abstentions, but mostly they vote. Every single faculty member is commended. Every single one. Some by a vote of 5-4.
Even Charlemagne?
Even Charlemagne gets through. Yeah, but he has, I forget what the vote is on him. I should know that. I don't remember it offhand. There's only one guy who comes through with unanimously to commend, and it's not John Tietjen. No, and it's not Robert Preuss either, Everybody gets voted against at least a little bit, other than this one prof that everybody who was universally beloved. But the bottom line is, every one of them makes it. So the statement of the Board of Control is there actually is no problem at Concordia Seminary, St. Louis. So that ended it all right there. No, what happens? It's January 15th, 1973. What's coming? Convention. And what's going to happen at the convention? Hopefully, but no. You have an election of the president, right? First time since 1969. So this is the first time Jack Preuss is up for re-election. And there is a concerted effort on the part of, let's see if I have that. I don't know if I have that or not. There's a concerted, no, I don't have the numbers, shoot. There's a concerted effort on the part of the moderates, John Tejan included, to unseat J.A.O. Price, and they think they have a chance. And they go to a person, I want to see how many of you know him, and they say to this person, would you be willing to let your name stand for president of Synod? And they think, somebody said it, and they think he said yes, but they didn't ask him clearly enough. And it's Oswald Hoffman, whoever got it, yep, whom you may know as the voice of the Lutheran Hour. Exactly. And they think, here's a guy, you know, he's not for either side per se, but he's a nice man. And if we're going to have peace, and more importantly, get rid of Jack Price, he's the guy that we're going to go for. So in this case, this is why I wish I would have had the numbers. In 1973, it's the first time that we actually have nominations for president before the Synod Convention. It's the first time that happens. And that means you're not going to have a primary ballot, and you don't have to have the 75% threshold on the first ballot. Well, I mean, you get what I mean. Any longer, because anybody, the top five who make the number of nominations, the top five nomination getters are all going to be on the ballot, and that's what you're going to vote on first thing. So far and away, Jack Price gets the most nominations. It's more than double that of Oswald Hoffman. And the third place guy is, I mean, he's not even close. It's not even close. It's a little, you know, Hoffman makes a decent showing, but Jack Price just buries him. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, it is the single most nominations an LCMS president has ever received at that point in time. So, seems, you know, there's a likelihood he's going to be reelected pretty easily. However, then it becomes a lot more easy because Oswald Hoffman says, you know what, never mind. And he withdraws his name. And the reason he withdraws his name is something that many of us have gone through. When you're nominated for synodical presidency or vice presidency, you are forced to agree to serve if elected, or you can't be on the ballot. You know, so you know, I regularly get this phone call from John Sias. Hey, you've been nominated for first VP or something like that. Do you want to do this? No. Okay, because if you say yes, you got to do it. I said no. Can I spell that for you? N-O. Don't want to do that. And but everybody gets that phone call, and you got to say. And he'll give you a little time if you need to think about it and that kind of thing. But anyway, Oswald Hoffman says, I can't in good conscience do this because I'm agreeing to accept a call I haven't received. So he withdraws. Well, this leaves the moderates without their guy. So they have to scramble and find somebody else. They run this guy named William Cohn, and he loses magnificently on the first ballot against Jack Price. Jack Price just sweeps right in. At the New Orleans Convention, and then there's a whole series of resolutions that are passed that support the whole Price program. So where he struggled a little bit in 71 in Milwaukee, he runs the table in 1973 at New Orleans. And the last day of the convention, they take up what had been Resolution 3-12, and it had been circulated in today's business. And 3-12 said that if John Tejan doesn't resign from the presidency of Concordia Seminary by the end of this convention, the convention will vote to remove him from office. Boom, right? Boom. Tejan, of course, is told, this is coming to the floor. Do you want to deal with this? And he says, sure. You know, bring it on. Well, in the end, the Synod passes 312A. And if you know how this stuff works, that means they changed it. They changed 312 to its first new form. And the new form says, we authorize the Board of Control to deal with John Tejan. And that's what comes before the Synod on the Friday the 13th, Friday, July 13th. And the Synod passes it, and that's when Tejan gives that big speech about, you know, hard word and, you know, so forth. Now, why change it? Because the Board of Control majority shifted. It went from a 5-4 moderate majority to a 5-4 conservative majority. And that changed everything. So they said, we'll have a board that can actually address the issue, rather than, and John Tejan, who had the faculty and the board behind him, suddenly only has the faculty. And if you know anything as a president, faculty, I love faculty. I'm a member of faculty right now, right? But when it comes to political power, this is the grand total of, I'm overstating the case, but you get my point. Push comes to shove, they're not the ones that have the direct power to carry things out. So now the Board of Control is in the hands of the conservatives. They elect a man by the name of E.J. Otto, chairman, very shortly, and begin the process of addressing John Tejan's continued service. And it's a fascinating, messy story that involves a pastor from Green Bay, Leonard Below. Does anybody know Leonard? Yeah. He was still, is he still alive? And then Harlan Harnap. Yep, exactly.
Harnap became a member of the board later. Yes.
But at this point, Below and Harnap had been members of Committee 3 of the Synod Convention and had which was seminary issues, and then they brought false doctrine charges against Tejan. Well, long story short, what does all this mean? Finally, and poor Lance isn't here to see it, this is my one picture of part of the faculty minority teaching during the moratorium. So what does this mean? What it means is when things go on over the course of the fall of 1973, and as you move into 1974, the board has, they've worked through the issues with Harnap and Below, and they're convinced that there's enough evidence regarding John Tejan not to fire him, but to suspend him from office. And they do that on Sunday evening, January 20th, 1974. Okay? So he's not fired, he's suspended. We use that word a lot today, haven't we? And with the suspension, he stays on campus, he gets his salary, the whole works. I mean, the only thing that changes is he doesn't have to work, So it's like, hey, all right. But the next morning, so Monday morning, January 21st, the students come together and they vote to have a moratorium on classes. That is to say, they say we're not going back to class until this whole thing with Tejan gets ironed out. And specifically, we want to know, if everybody's saying that our professors are teaching us false things, and part of that's the charge made against Tejan. We're not going back to class until you tell us who that is. So they stop going to class. The faculty then almost does that on Monday afternoon, but waits till Tuesday morning, January 22nd, and they vote to recognize the student moratorium, and they say, very importantly, and this is key as well, they say to the board, when you suspended John Tejan, you also suspended us. And so they stopped teaching. In the meantime, that's Robert Preuss there, so Jack Preuss's younger brother, teaching during the moratorium. He's named academic dean, so he's teaching classes and he's also the academic dean. Martin Charlemagne is named the acting president, amazingly enough. So he finally makes it. You're terrible. Patience wins. The two others Ralph Bowman is primarily at the CTCR, as I mentioned a couple of times. And then you have Lawrence Wunderlich and Richard Kahn are the other two professors that remain active during this time. And again, there's a lot of other stuff that's swirling around all this. My apologies for not getting those details. But the point is, again, Robert Preuss, is trying to bring a student body back into the classroom, trying to get professors to teach, teaching his own classes, and then functioning as academic dean. There's not a lot of time to take pictures. And again, you're not carrying your phone around with you like we do today. But the rest of the 400 out of 500 students, basically, as I mentioned earlier, and 45 out of 50-ish professors just stop. Just stop. Yes?
Was this just at St. Louis or?
Yes.
Any other?
Nope, only at St. Louis. Only at St. Louis. And this goes on for a month. For a month. Until finally, the board says, we just can't go on like this. They're paying the professors' salaries, right? The professors are living in campus housing for nothing, and yet they're not teaching. And there have been repeated pleas. Charlemagne, there's all this video, Charlemagne, please go back to work, Go back into the classroom. You have to start teaching again. We are teaching. How are you doing that? By not teaching,
Students paid tuition during this time?
They had already paid it for this quarter. Yeah, absolutely. Question, Jeff?
Just to kind of build on that question, what were the students doing? Were they attending classes with their quote-unquote exile or suspended?
No, I mean, here you see students in the classroom. What they did instead was engage in what was called Operation Outreach, and to tell what we have been taught, as they put it. And they went out all over the country to visit congregations, to interpret what was happening at the seminary for pastors and congregations. So they went all over the place, all over the place. Yes, question?
When they stopped, could they go to a different seminary or they just?
They could, but they couldn't get certified for ministry. And that was, I mentioned that right on the front end early this morning, again, because I wasn't sure I'd get to this point. But you had, and one of the ironies of this is that that kind of the language that you had to be certified by one of the two seminaries had not been in the bylaws of Synod until Herman Otten got ordained and served a congregation that was without certification. And so the moderates wrote into the handbook of Synod that you had to do this. And then here we are in 1974, and people are, well, here's the bylaw, you guys passed it, that kind of thing. They passed it at the 69 convention. That's why I always tell people, never write policy on the basis of events. Do policy on the basis of policy. What's the best policy? But they did it anyway. So yeah, great questions. And everything. I mean, it just all comes to a head when the professors keep saying, "You suspended us when you suspended John Tejan," and the board says, "No, we didn't. We suspended John Tejan, not you. Go back to work." The board finally says, "This is it." So on February 17th, Sunday evening. February 17th, they pass a resolution, the board does, that any faculty member who does not indicate by 12 p.m., by noon, on February 18th that they intend to return to class, they have essentially canceled their own contract. They fired themselves.
So like an email.
Something like that, yeah. If you don't respond to this email, you owe me $8 million. And of course, none of the faculty majority respond favorably to that. And so as of noon on February 18th, again, basically 45 out of 50 professors are no longer employed by Concordia Seminary, St. Louis. That's the end of it. What then is going to happen? And what happens next, of course, is the question of what are the students going to do who paid their tuition? They can pretty much do whatever they want, frankly. They're still students. And so on the morning of February 19th, they vote to go into exile. And they've been threatening this for about a week, clearly, at this point. If you don't, they told Preuss, if you don't remove the suspension of Tejan, if you don't roll back all the changes that have been made to the date of August 1st, 1973, we're going to restart our theological education with our faculty somewhere else. And, here's the threat. And again, folks, the board says, well, threaten away, if you will. So the students vote to go into exile down in the field house. And if you know the St. Louis campus, this is on the south side of campus down below. And then you walk up a little hill. It's not a big hill, but a little rise. And you go into the main quadrangle of the seminary, which at the northeast corner is Luther Tower. And it's very stunning. It's very beautiful. So they vote down in the field house, and now they start marching up to the quad. They have prepared crosses with the names of all the faculty and executive staff. Their names are on these. And they then place them into the quadrangle. So the professorial graveyard, as it were. And this is one of the real famous pictures of this. Again, you know they were prepared because somebody's gone up in the dorm and is hanging out the window to make sure they get the good picture of this. They all head out to the due east through the arch there, the Walther Arch beneath Luther Tower, and meet at the Luther statue, and they board up the Walther Arch. And miraculously, the boards fit perfectly. Yep. Yep. And I don't mean to make light of all this, but it's, it was completely spontaneous. Come on, guys. You can't pull something off like this without doing a little prep. And they worked hard at prep and that kind of thing. What's that?
The typography's a little off, but
How so?
well, it kind of reads as XE lead.
I got you. Then they march off campus and down to the little park that is on the extreme northeast corner of the campus into exile.
Was that Forest Parks Road?
Pardon?
Would that be Forest Parks Road?
It's not that far. It's right on DeMun. It's right at the end of DeMun, on the north end of DeMun. There's a little park there.
And there were news cameras there.
Oh yeah, of course. And they're greeted by the leadership of Eden Seminary, who welcome them and say, as you go into exile, you can use our campus, United Church of Christ Seminary. You can use our campus for your classes. The other place where they study and where they primarily hold their classes after this is at the Divinity School of St. Louis University, which is, of course, a Jesuit, that is to say, a Roman Catholic school. But there they're being welcomed, and Tejan's making a speech. There's video. If you search Seminex on YouTube, you can find video of this stuff, and it's really something. Yeah, it's really something to watch. And then, as I mentioned earlier, after they finish that, they go back on campus to have lunch. A man's got to eat. So all in all, a little more than an hour, and if you toss in the meetings that they're having earlier, it's the morning of February 19th. But the key argument is that we are Concordia Seminary, and we have been exiled. We've been forced out, but we remain what we were. We have the same faculty, we have the same students, we're teaching the same curriculum. Only thing that has changed is the place. And the argument of the synod, of course, is no. You don't have a synodical faculty anymore. It's nothing about the students per se. But the fact is that these professors no longer have the constitutional authority to certify men for ministry. Why? Because they're no longer employed by Concordia Seminary. Yeah. So that kicks off the whole thing. And that's the then what here. Can Seminex graduates be placed? They say yes. The synod will say no, ultimately in relatively uncertain terms, relatively. Can they be ordained? This is going to be a huge issue. Some district presidents start going ahead and ordaining guys anyway. Eight, look at me. 8, as a matter of fact. I'm a historian, I can't count. 8 district presidents ordain Seminex grads. And so then the question that drives is, can district presidents who ordain Seminex graduates remain district president? And the answer of the Synod and Convention in 1975 is no. And the Synod and Convention at Anaheim specifically tells Jack Preuss, if these guys don't stop, you remove them. Now, we always like to, you've heard it a billion times, and you have too, Joe. I mean, the highest authority in the Synod is the Synod and Convention. So when the Synod and Convention tells the president, you do this, he does that. Except Jack Preuss doesn't do it. He lets it slide with 4 guys, 4 district presidents. And the 4 he doesn't carry this out on as he's required to by the calendar. He says, well, they stopped ordaining Seminary graduates, so it doesn't apply to them. To which the 4 district presidents say, no, we didn't. We're still ordaining Seminary graduates. You should have fired us. Because they want to put this to the test.
They wanted to be martyred.
They wanted to be, because they were absolutely convinced that the majority of the church would follow them into this exile. They were absolutely convinced this was the case. Well, when those guys come back out and say, yeah, we're still doing it, and we're going to keep doing it, Jack Preuss then removes, on April 2nd, 1976, removes 4 district presidents. From the English district, the Atlantic district, New England district. What's the other one? It just went away. Shoot. Anyway, 4 district presidents. And when that happens, the folks, the Seminix leadership, professors, students, they say it's time to go. It's time to go. So that's April 2nd, 1976, that Preuss enacts that. Over the summer, the meetings continue amongst these groups, and then on December 3rd and 4th, 1976, so pretty quickly, the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches is formed, the AELC. And again, these guys, the folks that organize that are convinced we could have up to half the Missouri Synod come with us. And it's like, what are you smoking? What are you thinking? Yes, please.
Going back to the removal of teaching and faculty.
Oops.
If the Board of the Regents didn't have a majority of conservatives, that would have complicated.
It wouldn't have happened. It would not have happened.
Never happened. We would never had Seminary.
It wouldn't have played out the same way. And probably not in 1973, 74.
And the Jack Preuss couldn't just remove.
Nope, he could not. Nope. I mean, the way we're structured as a synod, the president can't do that. And a lot of times, President Harrison will take a lot of flack. Why don't you do something about this? And the way the synod is structured, and the way the handbook is written, he can't. He can't. So, if he does, now you're going where? Court.
Yeah.
And we spend a lot more time with the lawyers, as I did. Please.
As of today, how many seminaries does the LCMS church have?
2. Yeah. So one of the remarkable parts of this story is that you have 80, 100 students that remain at the St. Louis Seminary after the majority leave. Okay. They bounce back, amazingly quickly. And so by the opening of the 1975 academic year, so a year beyond this, you have 74, 75, and then 75, 76. 75, 76, they're up over a couple hundred students already again. And it just keeps building up through the early 80s. And there's also a simultaneous growth in the number of students at Springfield, then Fort Wayne at that point in time. So the conflict actually swells the ranks of our seminaries, interestingly enough, strangely enough. But this is one of the things Jack Preuss would regularly say. That's nobody wants to have a fighting church, but if a church is in a fight, that actually, strangely enough, shows a kind of health on the part that you're willing to stand up for something on this. And that attracted a number of guys to serve in the parish, serve as pastors. But those two. And of course, we have kind of a partnership with our colleagues in Canada. They have 2 seminaries there in St. Catharines, Ontario, which is almost Buffalo, and then up in Edmonton, Alberta. But they're both very small, very, very small.
St. Catherine's closed.
Nope, they're still open. They're going along, not easily. Edmonton's even more stretched, yeah.
Here's a question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I couldn't see in the light.
Why did President Preuss carry through the firings of those presidents of the district? I don't understand.
He said he interpreted the action of the Anaheim Convention that if they stopped ordaining Seminex graduates, then he didn't have to remove them. Yeah, and so he said, well, they've stopped. And then all the guys, no, we haven't stopped at all. We're going to keep going. And then he was kind of stuck. Yeah, and those guys all left too, even with the exception of one. With the exception of one in the Northwest District. Yes, Eunice.
From what I heard from my brother, because he asked me to do it more than once, is to write letters of support to the good guys, you know, like Jack Corse, who maybe aren't getting much support.
Yeah. I've read some letters from a Eunice Disson and a David Disson to the Board of Control of Concordia Seminary and to J.O. Price supporting the actions that he was taking. I thought, man, that's coincidence. Yeah, exactly. And there was. I mean, one of the things, now I'll say this, negative mail far outweighed positive mail. And that's part of the reason Walt was probably asking you to do this. But sometimes folk would say, well, there was no support for Jack Preuss's action. Yes, there was. A large part of the inaction, I think, on the part of a big segment of the Synod was the simple fact that, well, yeah, we agree. You know, I'm only going to write if I got something to gripe about, right? And so you don't get the same volume of mail. But it was clear when push came to shove, when the AELC was formed, at most, what was it, about 125 congregations out of more than 6,000, and about 100,000 members out of 2.8 million left the Synod. So it wasn't that much. Now, should some of those have left? You know, probably so. But it's not 50%. And it was never close to 50%. And it was never going to be anywhere near 50%. So why did that happen? How did these guys miss this? Well, John Teachin in his memoirs, you know, kind of blames the pastors for not being bold, not having courage of their convictions. And that's probably true to a certain degree, but I think there's another element. And that is one of the great dangers, and this is a danger for any group, whether they're conservative or liberal, whatever the case may be. You get in the echo chamber, and you start telling yourself, you know what, this is a great idea. And everybody agrees with you, and you think, what? We all agree. So that must mean everybody agrees with us. And the fact is, they don't. If you haven't persuaded them, they're not coming with you. And to make that kind of a break, to leave your church and go, you know, follow some of these guys who are a bunch of long-haired hippies, you know.
Do you have any idea how many churches there are like Grace in River Forest?
Very few.
Okay.
Yeah, in fact, that one is singular because of the way the original agreement was written between what became the congregation and the Synod, which owned and operated the college. Grace River Forest is right on the northeast corner of the what's now Concordia University Chicago campus, and they are. And the way the original agreement was written, that if Grace ever left the Synod for another Synod, that was the key word, then the property would revert to the college. So when Grace left the Synod, they became independent. They didn't join another Synod.
With only ELCA pastors.
Well, yeah, there's that. And well, initially AELC, when Dean Luking was the pastor there. Yeah, please, and then I'll get you Dustin.
Concerns right today about world government and the way everything's going. It's sort of like it's taken on the ELCA form that with days and this and that. You know.
Yeah. Well, let me put it this way. I think one of the temptations for me personally, as a confessional Lutheran, how do I want to say this? I was going to say, I want to win, right? I want to win this battle. And that's the wrong way to frame that. Because you and I are part of the church militant. And the battle is not going to end until the Lord returns. So I have to watch out for, I want our students, when they go out, I want our pastors to be deeply committed to the Lutheran confessions and committed to doing the right kind of things for the sake of the continued confession of the gospel. I want them to be energized by this. At the same time, and they've all heard me say, you've heard me say this, it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be, because we live in what? A sinful world. And the Lord's very clear, that we're fighting against the gates of hell. Now the promise is what? The gates of hell shall not prevail against the church, but that means what? The gates of hell are going to be trying to prevail against the church at every point, every day, all the time until the Lord returns. So we have to be cognizant and willing to stand up as the church militant and have that sure and certain hope in the victory that the resurrection of Christ gives to us. He has conquered. Everything is under his feet, right? Psalm 110. It's already done, and we're waiting for him to come back. And so in the interim, I don't like it. I don't like it. I want it to be over. I want the gospel, the pure gospel, to carry the day completely. And the fact that you read the book of Revelation, you believe it. What happens toward the end? Man, right? Or as I say to my grandkids, it does a swirly, right? And things are going to get worse. They're not going to get better, right? Isn't that what the book of Revelation tells us? Clear as a bell, right? So when we see it happening, we say what? Yeah. And what should that drive us to? Despair and passivity? No, absolutely not. Stand up and confess so that people hear the truth. That's what the Lord calls us to in the gray and latter days. Remember that hymn? Living in these gray and latter days. And I'm a church historian. This is I'm convinced part of the reason the Lord called me to this kind of work is that I am given to despair. I am a pessimist beyond belief, which I think is a great thing, because if you're pessimistic, when good things happen, you're like, wow, that's really good. And when bad things happen, it's like, yep, expected that. But the point being that we have to be realistic about the situation in which we find ourselves, but we can't allow it to overwhelm us and cause us to give up, because we have a greater hope. And that hope is centered in Christ, who suffered, died, and rose again victoriously on the third day. And that's our victory. And proclaiming that message is our victory. And so we do it even in the midst of all the stuff we deal with now. Thank you. Yeah.